Imagine waking up to a sky streaked with missiles, the air filled with thunderous explosions. That's exactly what Pakistan experienced just hours ago. India has unleashed hell on its neighbor, targeting at least 9 terror-linked locations across Pakistan and Pakistani-occupied Kashmir. But here's the real twist. This is just the beginning of a nightmare that goes far beyond the India-Pakistan conflict. Because for Pakistan, the real monster lurking in the shadows is China. Xi Jinping has dreaded this exact moment ever since Pakistan staged a horrific terrorist attack against India. On April 22nd, 2025, 5 heavily armed terrorists wielding M4 carbines and AK-47s quietly crossed into Indian territory, slipping into Pahalgam, a popular tourist spot in Kashmir. What followed was a massacre straight out of a nightmare. Just like the brutal attacks seen in Israel where civilians were deliberately hunted down, these men targeted Hindu civilians with chilling precision. They stopped tourists one by one, demanding they prove they were Muslim by reciting a Quranic verse. Those who passed were spared. Those who couldn't were forced to pull down their pants to check for circumcision. Practice common among Muslims, but not Hindus. The result? Hindu men who failed both tests were executed on the spot, their wives, children, and friends forced to witness the horror. It's a trauma that leaves scars deeper than any wound, and that's exactly why India isn't holding back anymore. It is retaliating with raw vengeance. But there's a larger game at play. Whether China likes it or not, it is being dragged into this conflict because if it doesn't intervene, the hundreds of billions it has poured into Pakistan won't just go up in flames, so will its entire South Asian strategy. But Pakistan has another problem, a military reliant on Chinese-made weapons. Weapons that have never faced a true battlefield test. That changes now. As the conflict escalates, China's military technology is facing its first true test, and the results are humiliating. Chinese-supplied radar and missile defense systems have utterly failed to protect Pakistani airspace, allowing India to strike every intended target, including one terrifyingly close to Lahore. Even worse, a Chinese-made JF-17 Thunder, a supposedly advanced 4th-generation fighter jet, has already been shot down. For both Islamabad and Beijing, this is nothing short of an embarrassment. If this conflict spirals into a full-scale war, no one will care who started it. The blame game will end, and a chain reaction will begin. Every nation with even a shred of influence will be pulled in, and China will be at the front of that line. Now, of course, YouTube isn't a fan of war-related topics, and CCP bots are not fans of videos criticizing the CCP, so we need your help more than ever. If you can, please hit that like and subscribe button below. It really helps us fight the algorithm. Now let's dive deeper. China and Pakistan proudly call themselves all-weather iron brothers. This deep bond began in 1951 when Pakistan became one of the first Muslim nations to recognize the new People's Republic of China. Since then, Beijing has poured billions into Islamabad, to the point where today 1/3 of Pakistan's entire external debt, roughly $30 billion, is owed to Chinese state banks and commercial lenders. But let's be honest, China doesn't care about Pakistan's stability or long-term prosperity. For the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, Pakistan is nothing more than a strategic cash cow, and the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPS, is the perfect example of how Beijing milks it. CPEC is a $62 billion mega project at the heart of China's Belt and Road Initiative. It includes a massive network of highways, railroads, fiber optic communication cables, power plants, and industrial parks, all linking Kashgar in China's Xinjiang province directly to Pakistan's deep water port of Gwadar on the Arabian Sea. Beijing has secured a 40-year lease on the port, pocketing around 90% of all revenue generated, while Pakistan is left scrambling for the scraps. But the real trap is in the contracts. China has cunningly structured them to make it nearly impossible for Pakistan to repay the massive loans tied to these projects. From the start, the terms were stacked against Pakistan. Chinese firms were handed huge equity stakes, generous long-term leases, and guaranteed payments. And it gets worse. Pakistan agreed to purchase electricity generated by CPEC power plants at extremely high fixed rates, payments they are legally obligated to make regardless of their economic situation. Some agreements even guarantee Chinese investors massive returns, as high as 34% annually. With terms like these, it's clear that sooner or later, Pakistan will be crushed by debt. Eventually, it will have no choice but to hand over full control and permanent rights to critical infrastructure, like ports, power plants, and highways, directly to China. Some of these deals openly guarantee Chinese investors massive returns, ranging from 34% to as much as 12% every year. With such terms, it's only a matter of time before Pakistan is buried under debt. Eventually, they'll be forced to give China full control and permanent rights rights over key infrastructure like ports, power plants, and highways. This is a classic debt trap, one that has already ensnared many other countries. But for China, CPEC is about much more than just quick profits. The true value lies in securing a critical alternative shipping route, allowing Chinese oil tankers and cargo ships to bypass the vulnerable Strait of Malacca. Currently, around 80% of China's imported oil travels through this narrow passage, which could be easily blocked by the US Navy or regional rivals like India during a crisis. That's why the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC, is a strategic lifeline for China, offering a secure backup route and reducing its dependence on the Malacca Strait. India is fully aware of this. It has already labeled the entire corridor a violation of its sovereignty because CPEC runs through territory India claims as its own. The southern endpoint at Gwadar Port is especially troubling for India, which suspects it could become a Chinese naval base. CPEC begins in China's Xinjiang region, crossing into Pakistan through the narrow Kunjarab Pass, then cuts through Gilgit-Baltistan, an area India considers part of Jammu and Kashmir. To India, this massive Chinese-funded project is a direct challenge. If conflict erupts, the northern half of CPEC could turn into an active war zone. China is aware of this danger, which is why it has stationed troops in the region to protect its investments. But in the event of a full-scale conflict, those investments could quickly become vulnerable targets. Highways, power plants, and other infrastructure would be exposed to Indian artillery, missiles, and airstrikes. Pakistan, heavily dependent on Chinese funding and military support, is already struggling to protect these projects. Its economy is collapsing, and its military is stretched thin. If Beijing wants to protect its billions in investments, it must decide whether to directly intervene with its forces, an option that seems unlikely. Further south, the situation in Balochistan is even more troubling for China. This vast, resource-rich region has a long history of conflict, dating back to Pakistan's founding in 1947. When British India was split, Balochistan was unsure about joining Pakistan. The princely state of Kalat initially sought independence but was pressured into joining Pakistan in 1948. This led to immediate resistance, with Prince Abdul Karim, the Khan of Kalat's brother, launching the first armed rebellion. The struggle has continued ever since. Balochistan is Pakistan's largest province, covering over 40% of the country's land, and is rich in natural resources: gas, copper, gold, and oil. Yet its people remain some of the poorest in the nation. Despite providing over 40% of Pakistan's natural gas, most locals lack basic connections to it. Instead of benefiting from their land's wealth, they face poverty, pollution, and neglect. Politically, Balak leaders are sidelined, while Islamabad and military elites maintain control. When China arrived in the late 2000s with billions to build roads, railways, and pipelines through Balochistan, it promised jobs, prosperity, and development. But those promises fell flat. Locals saw Chinese managers taking charge, military checkpoints spreading, and highways cutting through tribal lands. Alienation quickly turned to anger. Rebel groups, especially the Balochistan Liberation Army (BLA), began attacking Chinese interests. In April 2022, a suicide bomber targeted a university in Karachi, killing 3 Chinese teachers. A year earlier, a bus carrying Chinese engineers was bombed, killing 9. These are just a few of the high-profile attacks that have made global headlines. Across Balochistan, dozens of deadly attacks have targeted Chinese workers, engineers, convoys, and infrastructure. But China and Pakistan now face an even bigger problem. The Taliban's return to power in Afghanistan in 2021. Initially, many expected the Taliban to maintain friendly ties with Pakistan, given Islamabad's decades of support. But that didn't happen. Instead, the Taliban quickly grew distrustful of Pakistan, and relations soured. Armed clashes between Taliban fighters and Pakistani soldiers have become common along the border. In December 2022, Taliban forces attacked Pakistani border posts near Chaman, killing several soldiers. By September 2023, heavy fighting erupted again at the Torham border crossing, leaving multiple casualties on both sides. The Taliban accuses Pakistan of interfering in Afghanistan's affairs, harboring anti-Taliban militants, and acting like an enemy rather than an ally. Since the Taliban's return, Balak separatists have found it easier to operate along the porous Afghan-Pakistani border. For decades, Afghanistan has quietly provided refuge, shelter, and training grounds for anti-Pakistan groups. Now, with the Taliban in power and hostile to Pakistan, this trend has intensified. Militants can more easily move, plan, and launch attacks from Afghan territory. Meanwhile, the Taliban's relationship with India has surprisingly improved. Initially, India was wary, having supported Afghanistan's previous government, and viewed the Taliban as hostile. But recently, both sides have begun direct talks, exploring common interests. India has even sent humanitarian aid and reopened its embassy in Kabul, following the logic that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. There are even rumors, though unconfirmed, that some Taliban factions might be secretly helping India track down Pakistani militants along the border. Given the Taliban's history of cooperating with various militant groups, such secretive arrangements wouldn't be entirely surprising. The growing hostility between the Taliban and Pakistan only makes these reports more believable. In contrast, China's relationship with the Taliban is far more complicated. Publicly, the Taliban welcomes Chinese investment, hoping for much-needed funds and infrastructure. But privately, distrust lingers. The Taliban is deeply uneasy about China's harsh crackdown on Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, a region with strong ethnic, religious, and cultural ties to many Afghans. This underlying tension, combined with the chaos of Taliban rule, Baloch rebel attacks, and India's shifting strategy, has created a perfect storm for China and Pakistan, especially concerning their massive joint projects like CPEC and the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. To be clear, CPEC and BRI are closely linked but not the same. CPEC is just one part, though a crucial one, of China's much larger Belt and Road Initiative. BRI is China's grand strategy to build a global network of roads, ports, railways, and infrastructure connecting Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and even Europe. This vast project aims to cut costs, open new markets for Chinese goods, and position China as a dominant economic and political power. While CPEC is a massive undertaking, BRI is on a different scale altogether. It's the world's largest infrastructure initiative, a mega project of mega projects. China has already poured around $1 trillion into BRI, and experts believe the total could surpass $4 trillion by the late 2030s. That's trillion with a T, a figure large enough to reshape the global economy, politics, and power dynamics for decades. When China first launched BRI, many countries eagerly signed on, lured by promises of development and economic gains. It seemed like a dream come true, but in just a few years, the reality has become much darker. Many of these countries are now struggling to repay the massive Chinese loans they took to fund these ambitious projects. Some are even on the brink of bankruptcy. Sri Lanka is perhaps the most infamous example. After borrowing billions from China to build infrastructure like the massive Hambantota port, Sri Lanka found itself unable to repay the debt. Eventually, China took control of the port, turning a supposed opportunity into a strategic asset for Beijing. China secured a 99-year lease over Sri Lanka's Hambantota port, effectively gaining control of a key strategic asset near India. But Sri Lanka isn't alone. Across Africa, nations like Zambia, Kenya, and Ethiopia are buried under massive Chinese debt with little to show for it. Zambia even defaulted on international loans, largely because it couldn't keep up with Chinese repayments. Beijing expected Pakistan to follow the same path, drowning in debt just like these other countries. But instead of boosting Pakistan's economy, Chinese investments only deepened the crisis. The country now faces critically low foreign reserves, skyrocketing inflation, and soaring prices, struggling even to pay interest on its loans. China's real strategy was to recreate the Sri Lanka scenario, pushing Pakistan so deep into debt that Beijing could seize control of critical assets, especially in strategic areas like Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, POK, but this plan could collapse if conflict erupts. If India strikes first, targeting key infrastructure and reclaiming disputed territories, China's investments in Pakistan could become worthless overnight. Losing control of CPEC, the centerpiece of the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, would trigger a crisis. Countries involved in BRI would question their own partnerships with China, fearing they too could be abandoned. Xi Jinping's grand global strategy could unravel. This looming disaster is why China cannot afford for CPEC to fail. Currently, over 14,000 Chinese nationals, engineers, technicians, and even soldiers are stationed in Pakistan, many in high-risk areas like Gwadar and Balochistan, where militant attacks are common. In recent years, dozens of deadly attacks have targeted Chinese workers, forcing Beijing to deploy security teams with armored vehicles. But if conflict intensifies, these Chinese citizens could become immediate targets. So far, Indian strikes have been limited to Muzaffarabad, Kotli, and parts of Punjab. But Gwadar and Balochistan aren't far off, and any escalation could put Chinese workers in direct danger. If war breaks out, China would face a nightmare scenario, evacuating thousands of citizens from an active conflict zone while protecting billions of dollars in vulnerable infrastructure. Overwhelmed, Pakistan's military might even hand direct protection of key assets to Chinese forces. But Beijing knows it cannot ignore a threat to its people and projects. For years, China has pushed Pakistan to rely on Chinese-made weapons, making it the world's largest buyer of Chinese military gear. From JF-17 fighter jets and VT-4 tanks to armed drones and missile defense systems. This dependence means if China intervenes, its forces would integrate seamlessly with Pakistan's. Meanwhile, India would fight using a diverse mix of Russian, French, Israeli, American, and locally made weapons. Military analysts believe any India-Pakistan conflict would become a battlefield test between Chinese weaponry and India's Western-backed arsenal. The results could redefine China's global reputation as an arms supplier. If Chinese weapons fail, Beijing's defense industry could suffer a massive blow. The same risk applies to the West. If Indian weapons perform well, global buyers would take notice. Beyond weapons sales, China's stakes in Pakistan run even deeper. For decades, Pakistan has been China's frontline ally in South Asia, a critical buffer against India's growing power. This alliance was solidified in 1963 when Pakistan handed over the Shaksgam Valley, north of Kashmir, to China, strengthening Beijing's control over the region. Today, China directly controls 20 to 30% of Kashmir, including the high-altitude Aksai Chin region, also claimed by India. But Aksai Chin isn't just a disputed area. It's home to China's G219 highway, a crucial land route connecting Xinjiang to Tibet. Losing Aksai Chin or having this highway cut off would threaten China's western border security. If war breaks out, Indian forces could push into disputed areas, putting Indian troops within striking distance of China's line of actual control, LAC. Indian commanders have openly prepared for a two-front war, facing both Pakistan and China at once. The risks are clear. In 2020, a deadly clash in Ladakh's Galwan Valley saw Indian and Chinese troops in brutal hand-to-hand combat, leaving dozens dead and exposing just how quickly things can spiral out of control. For China, the message is undeniable. Losing Pakistan or its critical projects, there is simply not an option. In a conflict with Pakistan, India could deliberately provoke tensions near Ladakh, forcing China to divert resources to Tibet, a region already fragile for Beijing, both politically and militarily. Even a minor clash here could escalate into a wider crisis. India has prepared for this scenario, acquiring advanced assets like French Rafale jets, designed for high-altitude operations. More importantly, India possesses the BrahMos missile, a supersonic weapon developed with Russia that can strike deep into enemy territory at 3 times the speed of sound, making it nearly impossible to intercept. Deployed along the Himalayan border, BrahMos missiles would grant India a strategic edge, directly threatening Chinese bases and infrastructure in Tibet. Yet despite these reasons to support Pakistan, China has strong incentives to stay out. Its once booming economy has sharply slowed. In 2023 to 2024, China struggled with a severe real estate crash and sluggish domestic demand. Government debt soared to 60.5% of GDP by 2024, up from 38.5% just 5 years earlier. Including corporate, household, and local government debt, the total now exceeds 312% of GDP. One of the world's highest. Local governments are drowning in unpaid mortgages for ghost cities and empty malls. Beijing is desperately injecting billions into the economy, trying to hit modest 5% growth targets. Beijing also understands that the root of this crisis, terrorist groups operating from Pakistan, must be dealt with. If India fails to eliminate these threats, China may feel forced to act directly, securing its investments and citizens in the region. But it would much prefer a solution that avoids a broader conflict because the stakes are simply too high for all involved. A conflict with India in the Himalayas would force Beijing to spread its military even thinner, pulling resources from critical regions. Worse, it could draw in major powers. If the US backed India, or if Russia felt compelled to support China, a regional war could spiral into a global crisis. China is well aware of this risk. The US has grown closer to India through the Quad and various defense agreements. Publicly, Washington would call for peace, but privately it would likely accelerate arms deliveries, share intelligence, and offer diplomatic support to India. Russia would face a dilemma. It has a strategic partnership with Beijing, but is also one of India's largest arms suppliers. Likely, Moscow would maintain a neutral stance, calling for peace while quietly supporting both sides to preserve influence. Gulf nations like Saudi Arabia and the UAE could also be dragged in. Pakistan has historically relied on these allies for financial aid and political support. Yet, in a China-India crisis, they would tread carefully, not wanting to alienate either side. Ultimately, a regional war involving China would destabilize global politics. Beijing may benefit from a distracted India, but an all-out war is a different story, too costly and risky. A direct clash with India is not in China's interest, especially given its internal troubles.